You know this part of me that loves to go into the unknown, into the unknown.
Alrighty, so the communists might have been willing to leap into the unknown, to the great ideological experiment that was War Communism, but for ordinary people, it really sucked. I've got my workplace militarized. I've got my Civil War sausage. Right. I roped in Queen Elsa of Arendelle because that idea of just being so bloody cold would have been one of the really, noticeable, if you lack of a articulate word, experience for everyday people under war communism during the Civil War. So that's what we're going to have a little YOLO chat about today, the impacts for everyday people of the Civil War. It was awful. For everyday people, living conditions were dreadful during the Civil War years. There were chronic shortages of fuel, so people were people were cold. That's why we had Elsa going into the unknown. So people were then forced to do things like strip their houses of timber, of their fences, and the walls in a desperate bid to burn anything because coal became unavailable. That reduced production as well, but I want to focus more on the experience of everyday people. Food was critical. People resorted to eating things they wouldn't normally eat, like Civil War sausage, which is horse meat. And there were other awful cases too, where people would resort to eat even worse things that we'll talk about in a minute. In this that's just the cities, in this desperate search for food, enormous numbers of city dwellers fled Petrograd and Moscow to the countryside in a desperate search for food, and it led to incredible demographic changes. So by 1920, Petrograd's population had fallen by 70% and Moscow's by 50%. And you can imagine what that meant then if you were familiar with those cities at the time. You'd be shocked at where are all the people gone. And the other thing too, you'd just witness incredible poverty as well, that everything would look really dirty, everything would look very, very run down. Industrial production then, because of the reduction of availability of fuel and the availability of a productive workforce, that impacted the economy. Large-scale industrial production fell to 13% of what it was producing before the World War I. Steel output was at 4% of what it was producing in 1913. Iron ore at 1.5%, and copper 0. That one doing nothing. Famine and disease, in addition to cold, were the iconic experiences of the Civil War years. Because of the breakdown of public services, the ability of the authorities to maintain infrastructure, sewage pipes froze and burst. And so there was poopy around a fair bit, and that led to terrible disease like typhus, and people were affected by diseases that were spread by lice as well. So typhus and cholera were really rampant. These are really gross. If you don't know what the symptoms of those are, so typhus, you get a horrendous fever, and cholera, you're going to get the most violent diarrhea you've ever experienced. Hashtag fun times. Okay, family life was severely disrupted because millions of children were orphaned. And that was really, really terrible. Now, I mentioned too, so in the city you might have been eating Civil War sausage. Nay. As food became more critical out in the countryside, villagers took even more desperate measures, eating famine bread. That's mud pies. Don't bake those and try those at home, kids. That won't end out at all well for you. Or human beings. Cannibalism. Cannibalism became not uncommon, as one villager recalled. As one man from the countryside recalled, in our village, everyone eats human flesh, but they hide it. There are several cafeterias in the village, and all of them serve up young children. Yeah, awful. What a incredible indicator, though, of a society under strain. That the revolution was literally devouring its children. You might have heard of that little phrase to describe the way in which the revolution ultimately turned on those it was meant to benefit. Much to the great bothersome of Soviet authorities, Russia was forced to rely on foreign aid, particularly that provided by the American Relief Administration, the ARA, and they were feeding by 1922 10 million Russians a day in their soup kitchens. And good little quote by historian W.H. Chamberlain. He said, "The realm which the Bolsheviks conquered bore strong resemblance to a desert." And this terrible level of poverty, sickness, and cold is the way to imagine living in that time. The countryside then was rife for revolt, and that we've referenced that previously when we've spoken about the Greens movement. So this helped to really antagonize the peasants against the communist authorities. So there were open revolts in the Ukraine led by Makhno and Antonov in the Tambov region. Really interesting the slogans that the peasant rebels used, which are "Long live the Bolsheviks, death to the communists, long live Lenin, down with Trotsky." The peasants were confused about exactly, who was who, but what they're doing is essentially articulating that they want to return to the revolutionary values that they saw emerge in 1917 in the October Revolution. They don't want, the Civil War era policies of Prodovertska, of grain requisitioning. Many remain committed to the idea of Soviet power, but they are angry at the then current Soviet authorities. As one peasant said, "We welcome Soviet power, but give us plows, harrows, machines, and stop seizing our grain, milk, eggs, and meat." Another said, "The land belongs to us, but the bread belongs to you. The water belongs to us, but the fish to you. The forest ours, but the timber is yours." Take home message of all this little chat is it sucked, and it really impacted everyday people, workers, peasants, and the bourgeoisie. Fun times. Okay, stay fully sick or not fully sick. До свидания.